Recently I salvaged some hat and coat stands from an office clearance. Most of them were made from oak, which I could reuse for other projects. I separated the stands from the upright pieces using a handsaw. These upright pieces would be the most useful to me as they were quite long. So I was left with lots of short 250mm pieces of oak that I wanted to find a use for, and I decided to use them to make an end grain chopping board or butcher's block. These pieces had a slight taper on one side, so I cut that piece off on the table saw to make each piece square. I ran all 4 faces of each piece through the thickness planer to remove the finish, get them all squared up and to a consistent size. And then I could glue them up into 2 panels, one panel made up of 10 pieces and one panel made up of 9 pieces. I'll explain why later. When the glue had set, I used a hand plane to clean up the surfaces of each panel. First planing across the grain, then diagonally, and then with the grain. And I kept checking each surface with a speed square to make sure everything was good and straight. Then I could clean up the ends of each panel on the crosscut sled on my table saw. I set up a stop block at 40mm from the blade. This would be the thickness of the butcher's block. And then I cut each panel into strips. I used some 40 grit sandpaper stuck to a flat piece of melamine to help flatten the side grain of each strip. And then I could lay out the strips for gluing. The reason one of the panels was made up of 9 pieces and the other 10 was to allow me to alternate the strips to stagger the glue joints, which I thought would make the butcher's block stronger. Once the glue had dried, I used my belt sander to level each surface. I started with a 60 grit belt, then an 80 and finally 120. Then I used a 120 grit on my random orbital sander. I trimmed the edges on the table saw. And then sanded those too. Again using a square to make sure that the edges were straight. Next, I beveled the edges with a block plane, being careful not to chip out at the end of each stroke. I sanded the bevel with 120 grit paper too, and I also beveled the corners and sanded those. Then I did some hand sanding using 240, 400 and finally 600 grit. I applied a mineral oil to the butcher's block, which is a food safe oil so it won't go rancid over time. I gave it about 3 coats in total, leaving it a day or so to soak into the end grain of the wood as much as possible, so that there was a good amount of oil on the block to protect the wood. Finally, I fitted some rubber feet to the bottom so that it wouldn't slip around on a kitchen worktop. I placed these 25mm in from each corner.